Well, without further delay, let me bring my guest on, and that is none other. I'm going to call him Dr. Layne Norton. I know he doesn't get called doctor too much on his channel, but how you doing, man?
I'm great. How are you? It's been a hot minute. I think it's probably been like 7-8 years since I've been on the show, something like that.
Yeah, the last show we did was reverse dieting.
When you were doing so probably like 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
We're going to talk about diet today because I think you're one of the sanest people on the planet when it comes to diet, right? So I know. Look, I know that you're in your face kind of guy and tough love kind of guy, but the reality is you're a person who says, look, man, eat what you want within reason.
Yeah.
You can still lose weight if you do certain things. And most diet gurus in the world say, when asked what's the best diet, they'll say the one that someone will stick with the longest. Because let's face it, consistency is really the magic in diet, not necessarily the food that you're eating. And you're one of the guys that's continually, like, you didn't hop on the carnivore bandwagon. You really didn't hop on the keto bandwagon. We're going to plug your app. And I know that your app works with all of those. But you've been a flexible diet guy for your entire career, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I was on the clean eating side of flexible dieting when I first started. But I mean, so when I first started bodybuilding, I mean, I read the bodybuilding magazines like anybody, right? And but I couldn't afford to get I was in college. I couldn't afford to get fresh caught organic salmon, and all this kind of stuff. And it's so funny. I feel like now looking back, these guys probably didn't eat that either, or a lot of them probably didn't eat that. It's just they wanted to find a way to come up with the cleanest diet possible to explain to people that, it's not the 2 grams of test a week I'm taking. It's the fresh caught organic salmon. But they would leave the macros at the end of the diet that these guys would follow. And I'd be like, well, I can't go get some of those foods, but I can hit those macros. And so I started doing that. And that's kind of how that started. But what's funny is, people, I think a lot of the diet zealotism comes from a good place insofar as people have something that worked for them.
Right.
And because we view everything through our own prism, and this gets into politics too, because this is part of the reason the country is so divided. We can't understand how that wouldn't work for somebody else, right? We can't understand how somebody else wouldn't think like us, right? So if you have, for me, flexible dieting worked for me. Like for me, I used to try to eat clean. And what would happen is when I exposed myself to a non-clean food, right? So like my roommates bring home pizza or something like that, I couldn't just have one slice. If I ate it, I would just end up eating as much as I possibly could. Right. And that's actually called a disinhibition reflex in the scientific literature. Whereas when I said, I'm going to stop worrying so much about trying to be clean, and I'm just going to focus on hitting my macros. And if that means I have a non-clean food every once in a while, well, the funny thing is I actually probably ate less junk food because I allowed myself to do that, because I wasn't having these huge blowout binges. And it was funny, years ago, I was going to debate a guy about flexible dieting versus clean eating. And my opening argument, I had screenshots from his Facebook of his weekly cheat meal. And I said, you said clean eating is better than what I do. Here's how much junk food I eat a week. Here's how much junk food you eat in your cheat meal. You actually get more calories from the junk food you eat than I do. So how do you explain that? So somehow that one day doesn't matter, or, whatnot. So for me, if you tell me, you can have the foods you want as long as you're fitting it within your budget, allowance, I don't have any problems with compliance. It's easy for me. It actually is. Like to get super shredded is difficult because it's difficult for everybody. But my wife even commented, like when I last November, I did kind of what we call it a Shred with Layne promotion, because I hadn't done like an actual physique photo shoot in a long time. And we were like, we could use some new images. So I got pretty darn lean. And my wife even commented, she's like, it's disgusting to me how easy this was for you, that you didn't even really complain about the diet. I got a little irritable near the end and a little bit of brain fog. But I wasn't like ever like, oh my God, I miss this food so much. I just can't wait to
Right.
have this. Like it wasn't like that. And so that works for me. But probably circa like 2010, 11, 12, whatever, I started to drift, a little bit towards zealotism insofar as because it worked so well for me, I just thought that this would be the solution for everybody. But here's the thing. When you actually coach people and you talk to people, and if you actually pay attention, you find that, what worked for you won't work for somebody else necessarily. And when we always say that and we think what we mean is physiology, people say, well, that diet didn't work for me. We're not that different physiologically.
No.
Like really, there's been diet studies, like the Diet Fit study looked at different polymorphisms on genes and how people reacted to high carb versus low carb. And they honestly didn't really find anything impressive. They thought they would, they didn't. When people say what worked for me, what they really mean is this felt very easy. This felt the least restrictive for me. And you find that with anything. You've got people who say, I tried flexible dieting, the whole trying to hit my macros, like it gave me anxiety, but I did intermittent fasting and that just, I wasn't even hungry, or people say keto, I went on a ketogenic diet or low carb diet. I never had any hunger. It felt easy. And what I always tell people is find the methodology that feels the easiest. Like we get caught up in the margins and people really major in the minors when it comes to diet. Because, I always come back to this. If you lose a significant amount of weight, so let's, not people like me who are already lean, once you're that level, then we can worry about like, all right, your saturated fat intake versus your fiber and all this other like minutia, right? But if you're overweight or obese, if you lose weight through whatever methodology, your blood markers will improve, most likely. I mean, look at Dr. Mark Haub. So he was a Kansas State professor. He did the Twinkie diet. So he did an 1,800 calorie diet. I think like almost 60% of it was junk food. Like the calories were junk food. He lost 27 pounds in 12 weeks and all of his blood markers improved, right? And we have this data. There was a meta-analysis by Naud in 2014 where they looked at diets that were equal in calories. So the inclusion criteria was they had to compare diets that were equal in calories, but varied their carbohydrate and fat intake. And what they found was there was no significant differences in really any blood marker for health based on these two diets. What was significant was how much weight did they lose? And basically they said, basically the conclusion was virtually all the health benefits from dieting could be explained, the majority of which can be explained by the weight loss. So, when people talk about, this causes inflammation, this does that, adipose tissue causes inflammation.
Yes.
Adipose tissue secretes adipokines. Those are pro-inflammatory. It's an orchestra of stuff coming together. But when people try to pick out isolated macronutrients or isolated nutrients, and you're just really disappointed with the results when you look at them. I mean, like sugar, for example. I mean, people was, well, sugar is pro-inflammatory. Not if you equate calories. It's not. Now, is it easy to overconsume foods that are high in sugar and thus get more calories, get more adipose, and become more pro-inflammatory? Absolutely. So people will strawman what I say. I'm not saying that you should eat a lot of sugar, right?
Right.
But what I'm saying is, and I think it's important for people to understand that you don't have to have so much food anxiety. And I see that a ton. Like there's people are so afraid to eat anything. And I think it actually stops a lot of people from even trying because, this Netflix documentary said, I can't have any carbohydrate. This one said, all animal products are bad. And, people, they go, well, I can't, I don't even know where to start. And it seems like anything's going to kill me. So I might as well just, fuck off and do whatever. Oh,
right. No, okay. Yeah.
So I think that like what I've tried to do is say, listen, like there are certain things, like I don't want to totally dismiss it. There is some evidence that there could be some mechanisms where sugar independently could lead to a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. But I mean, when you equate everything and you're talking about this, it's very, very small.
Well,
You know,
especially if, as you point out, especially if you're successfully losing weight and you're reducing that metabolic debris that's
yeah,
causing so many problems, then the change that sugar potentially could invoke is probably negligible when you net everything out. And I
yeah,
also think that over the past 15 years I've been doing this show, there's a lot of people who want to forget about calories. You know, the calorie isn't a calorie discussion. It's like, no, if you're eating protein, you can overeat protein and you won't get fat. That's not true.
yeah.
If you eat more energy than your body uses, then it has to store it as a surplus, and that means it turns it into fat. And so we come full circle now to, oh wow, a calorie does matter. It kind of seems like, to me, at least. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think part of that is people don't understand the actual argument. They make a lot of straw man arguments. So I'll take the one I always get. When I say that calories matter and that it is calories in, calories out when it comes to weight loss. One, people confuse that and they'll say, "Well, I lost weight without tracking calories." Okay, but that's calories in, calories out. We're talking about your energy intake versus your energy expenditure. And then they say, well, my watch said I burn, 2,500 a day and I was eating 2,200 and I didn't lose weight. Well, you're assuming that your watch is actually accurate.
Right.
Like if you didn't lose weight here's the other thing that messes people up is they'll weigh themselves sporadically and they'll go, oh, well, I did this and I gained 2 pounds or whatever. Well, did you weigh yourself every single day and take the average of those weights for the week? Because that's what I do. And I can tell you that those fluctuations, like people say, well, I can fluctuate 10 pounds in a week, maybe from like one day to the next and morning to night. But if you're taking the averages, you don't see those big fluctuations typically. You might see a couple pounds, but for the most part, you don't see that. So that confuses people a lot when they see that. Or, they'll go to an online calculator that's going to give them their calorie deficit. They'll plug it in, they'll follow it, they don't lose weight. They assume, oh, calorie deficits don't work. No, it just means that prediction, that estimation of what a calorie deficit should be for you is not accurate for you. So I think that's where a lot of people get hung up on that. And the other one is when you say calories in, calories out, a lot of people say, well, you saying that 200 calories from M&Ms is the same as 200 calories from a chicken breast. No. Well, here's the rub. Calorie is just a unit of measurement. So all calories are equal. Like saying, a calorie is not a calorie is like saying, okay, a dollar is not a dollar. It's just a unit of measurement, right?
Right.
Now, if I'm my favorite, I like to use financial explanations because I feel like it's more intuitive for people. If I take my dollars and I invest them in a Ferrari, that's not a very good investment. Depreciating asset, it's not going to bring me a lot of returns, if any. If I invest those in good growth mutual funds, I'm going to get a lot more back. So, yes, 200 calories from chicken breast are the same 200 calories from M&Ms, but those calories will have a differential impact on what happens in terms of my returns on energy expenditure. So we do know, and there was actually a really recent paper that came out with very, very controlled metabolic reward study showing that high protein diets do in fact increase energy expenditure, and even independent of the increases in lean body mass. Because some people have said, well, high protein diets increase lean body mass. That's why you see an increase in energy expenditure. And it looks like, yes, it does do that, but there seems to be an independent effect as well.
Metabolizing protein is a net loss type of a thing on the body. It takes more energy to metabolize it and turn it into something, either an energy substrate or to turn it into something it can store. So it takes more energy of the body, right?
Right. So, and we got to be careful with how we frame that. So it's still a net energy positive, right? So the TEF or DIT, we call it thermic effective food or diet induced thermogenesis. Basically, how much energy does your body have to input in order to extract the calories from the food you eat? Lipids, fats are like 0 to 3%. Carbohydrates are around 5 to 10%, and protein is around 20 to 30%. Alcohol is like 10 to 20%. It's intermediate. So when you are taking in protein, you are expending more energy, but you're still getting a net out of the calories you eat. Like you're still getting a net. Now, protein also has benefits for lean body mass, so there's also that to consider as well. But yeah, like of course, like high protein diets have benefits. Nobody's going to argue it, but that's not the same thing as saying that calories matter. And people also they say, well, you made the comment. People will claim you can't overeat protein. You could probably overeat it to the point where you would gain fat, but it's very hard to overeat protein to that amount. I mean, anybody who's ever tried to eat like a really high amount of protein, like say 2 grams per pound of body weight, I mean, it gets to be like a job at a certain point. It's a
Yeah.
lot of protein. And that's great for satiety. Some people love that for satiety. But now the interesting question is, could you store those? Whenever people say, you can't store, X is fat, I'm always like, well, what do you think happens to those carbons that you take in? Do they just like vanish into thin air? Like, they got to go somewhere. Like if energy goes into a system, your body, it has to come out somewhere. All right. Or be stored. Right. Like, and
Right.
we lose, like it's, you lose it in sweat, you lose it in your breath, you lose it in your urine, you lose a little bit in feces, that sort of thing. But it's got to come out somewhere. So if there's something that you're making this claim about, where's it going, right?
Right. Right.
That's what I always use to break down some of these claims. Well, when it comes to protein, what's probably happening, the carbon skeletons from protein, do you actually store those as fat? I think it's probably a very low amount. I mean, we know that the carbohydrate in a normal diet, the amount of carbohydrate that gets stored as adipose is very, very low. It's like less than 2%. I think there was an overfeeding study where they overfed people by, I think, like around 1,000 calories above their maintenance from carbohydrate. Or no, sorry, it was from a mix of carbohydrate and fat. And they found that I think the people stored like 282 grams of fat in a day. And of that, 278 grams of it was from dietary fat.
Wow.
Whereas only 4 grams was from de novo lipogenesis. Now, if you completely cut out dietary fat and you pump carbohydrate up enough, trust me, the body will adapt, ramp up de novo lipogenesis, and you'll store a hell of a lot more of it. But in a normal mixed diet, you don't really store much carbohydrate as fat. So I doubt that you'd store much protein as fat either, because the pathway to get to adipose for the carbon skeleton from protein would be similar to that of carbohydrate, except for the ketogenic amino acids. But what protein would do is provide a caloric cushion for the dietary fat or carbohydrate you eat to be stored as fat. So that's where people may be technically correct in saying that we don't store protein as fat. True, but if you're eating any dietary fat whatsoever and you're eating a huge amount of protein that causes you to be in a caloric surplus, then you're going to store more of that dietary fat as fat. So, these are, I think, part of the reason people don't like to admit calories matter is because it's like it takes away kind of the biohacking sort of
Yeah,
community.
right, right. Oh, you can fool the body. But what I was gonna say, and to summarize this is, but none of this really matters if you're in a caloric deficit. Am I right? Like all these manipulations by the body kind of are very complicated. Most people go, "Oh, F it. I am just not, like you said, I'm just not gonna eat." But the reality is if you know that you're truly in a caloric deficit, and you can establish that over time, or you can go get a calorimeter, or I have a breathing unit that hooks up to my iPhone, and you determine like oh, here, this is how many calories I need a day just to maintain, and you're eating 300 or 400 calories or less a day, then none of this really matters. You don't have to worry about the mixing of carbs and fats and all that other stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that like, nothing else matters, because like that's a very strong statement. There probably are things that matter a little bit, but when it comes to body composition and most markers of health, I would say that the data is pretty strong that, even if you're in a calorie deficit, if you pump your saturated fat up high enough, you can start to get some wonky things happening with LDL cholesterol and LDL oxidation of cholesterol, that sort of thing. So I don't think I'd recommend that. But, if it comes down to like, if somebody was asking me, like, let's create a hypothetical of, somebody says, well, the diet I can stick to is a high saturated fat diet, but it's allowing me to lose fat. Am I making myself worse? No, you're probably getting healthier by losing the weight. Now, are you getting as healthy as you possibly could be if you were including less saturated fat and more polyunsaturated fats? Probably not. And this is where like people in carnivore get it really twisted, because they'll say, well, look at me, I'm healthy and my LDL cholesterol is 500 and I haven't dropped dead yet. And that represents a fundamental misunderstanding of one, how LDL cholesterol works in terms of heart disease, and two, showing that doesn't really prove anything, right? Like you can find people who were very healthy, who had low cholesterol, who had a heart attack. You can find people who had high cholesterol who didn't have heart attacks and lived to old age, right? And there's always outliers. But that's why we operate, when we make recommendations, we look at what the averages do. That's very important, because that's what people get all pissed off about the government and their recommendations and whatnot. The government's got to make recommendations based on averages. Like that's just the nature of the game, and that's a very difficult task to do. So, this misunderstanding, a lot of it is, I think people don't understand the concept of lifetime risk, right? So I use the example of compounding interest, right? So there's I'll give an example just because it's fresh on my mind, but I recently wrote a big debunking of Paul Saladino's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. It was like 50 pages long and almost 300 citations. But, Paul will say something like, well, my LDL is 500. I've been this way for several years, and look at me, I'm healthy. I don't have any calcium in my arteries, this and that. No, not right now. But and he may very well be pretty healthy, but is he as healthy as he possibly could be if his cholesterol was lower? Probably not. Now, people will look at like these randomized controlled trials where they do high saturated fat versus low saturated fat, and they say, oh, well, look, there was no difference in outcomes. Well, yeah, but you can only run a randomized controlled trial for a couple of years. Having high LDL is not the difference between dying at 80 and dying at 40. It's the difference between dying at 80 and dying at 75, on average. Like that's the difference. And what I'll use the example is, it's like compounding interest, right? So if you have two people and they both invest $8,000 at like, let's say 25 years old, and one person is getting 6% interest and one person is getting 7% interest. Well, if you look at them after 3 years or a couple of years, there's not going to be much difference in how much money they have. Like they're just not. But if you look at them by the time they're 70, there's going to be a huge difference in how much money they have if they're both getting if they're both getting 1% difference in interest. That's because it's a lifetime accrual, right? And it's not the exact same thing, so I'm guilty of a little bit of false equivalence, but that it's a lifetime exposure.
It's easy to understand. No, I get it. I get it completely. I want to take a commercial break. I want to plug something real quick too. So you listen to this interview and you're thinking, wow, this sounds really complex and I don't even know where to start. Well, there's an app, and where can people get this? At the App Store?
Yeah, so we're on Apple and Android. So you can go to our website, joincarbon.com, and you can download from either one. So we got it on the App Store and Google Play.
And regardless of what your diet style is, keto, if you're vegan, if you're low carb or low fat, you will be able to use this app to help guide you to your goals. And again, this is not a zealot app. This isn't like, no, you've got to eat this only. I see people on keto boards, and they say, oh, it's not working. My hair's falling out. I can't sleep. And I want to say, get the F off the diet. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's for you. Like, why people are going, oh, you're not eating enough fat, or it's like, it's not working for you. That's why I agree with you. Diet has become religion. Like, and I've said on this show dozens of times, if your diet style comes with an annual cruise and a membership card, you're doing it for the wrong reason. Absolutely. But there's an app out there for sensible people who want to focus on goals and get there. You can go. It's called Get Carbon, right? It's called the Carbon app, right? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, join Carbon. So it's called Carbon Diet Coach, and basically, it does all the same things a nutritional coach would do. Where you go there, you put your information in terms of your weight, your body fat, some other measurements. If you're not sure your body fat, we can help you estimate it. And then you give your dietary preference. You listed off the dietary preferences, and then even within those dietary preferences, you can shimmy the macros a little bit within certain ranges. So you can really tailor it to what's sustainable for you, what's easiest for you. And then you check in with the coaching part of the app every week. We recommend logging your weight daily because that gives more accurate data. And then the coach will adjust or not adjust your macros based on how you're progressing and your specific goal. And you can even adjust your rate of loss or rate of gain depending on what your goal is. And then we have an integrated food tracker into it as well. So it's kind of like, people say, what's the difference between this and MyFitnessPal? Well, MyFitnessPal is just a tracker. This is a coaching app primarily. You're paying for the coaching portion. It's $9.99 a month or less. It's less if you buy 6 months or a year up front. And it's the best thing going. Honestly, I've used it to coach me for the past year and a half. And it's cool to use something that you designed, the logic that you designed. And people will say, well, why do you need something to coach you? I'm like, because I'm an emotional idiot like everyone else, I'm liable to make stupid decisions based on emotion and not logic. And so just having an app to, kind of crunch the data unbiasedly and say, no, here's what you're doing. That takes so much stress away from me. It's been, I'm just happy to have it just for me. So thanks for plugging that, but we really do believe it's a great thing.
I'm doing the audience a big favor by plugging it. My intentions was to help them. You're very successful. You don't need me, but they need you. They need you. Let's take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. We're talking with Layne Norton. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High-quality, pasture-raised, great-tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose-to-tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to shrnetwork.biz/White Oak and use code SHR20 to save 20% off your entire first order. One of my favorite things to talk about when people say, well, I have the thrifty gene. I can't lose weight. And I say, and this is pretty crude, but you'll probably like it because you like these kind of things. I'd say, if you look in a prisoner of war camp, there's never this one fat guy. Joe, they're starving him. The guy's still 300 pounds. I don't understand it. Oh, he has the thrifty gene. When you starve people, they all get skinny. But are there any confounding factors here that we have to take into consideration? Maybe menopause for women, anything like that?
So great question. And yes, there are some things that do make a difference. And certainly not everyone has the same level of energy expenditure. Otherwise, we'd all have, relatively similar physiques or body fat levels. So let's look at a big picture. So you have your total daily energy expenditure is how many calories or how much energy you exert on a daily basis, which fluctuates, but it's basically made up of your resting energy expenditure, which is just basically how much energy it costs to keep the lights on, right? Keep your organs working, blood flowing, all that good stuff. And that actually turns out for most people is the majority of their energy expenditure. Anywhere from 50 to 70% of our daily energy expenditure is resting energy expenditure. Then you have your NEAT, which is kind of non-purposeful movements throughout the day. So if you're like a fidgeter or you pace, things that you're not trying to do, unintentional movements is probably the best way to describe that, that's actually a pretty significant portion of our energy expenditure. And I'll touch on this a little bit later. Then we have our TEF, which we already discussed. That's only 5 to 10% of our daily energy expenditure. And then you've got whatever exercise you throw on top of that. Now, If you've got some of these Olympic athletes who are training, 6 hours a day, their exercise may be the biggest portion of their energy expenditure, compared to resting energy expenditure. But for most people who aren't training for hours a day, resting energy expenditure is the greatest variable. So those are the basic four. All right. Now, what I'll always say is, okay, if you are a slow metabolism, or you have something that's causing you to have difficulty losing weight, then it has to be impacting one of those variables. Like there's not, this isn't magic. This isn't wizardry. Those things account for our daily energy expenditure. So let's take something like, for example, that does make a difference, like thyroid hormone, right? So people with low thyroid, I think the lowest I've seen in the literature is it can decrease their resting energy expenditure by about 25%. Okay. Now that's pretty significant. All right. That's, if you do the math, it ends up being something like, 400 calories a day for the average person, which is significant. But that doesn't mean you can't lose weight. That just means it's harder for you than the average person. And additionally, you can get treatment for that. You can fix that to where it's normal and should be not impacting your energy expenditure anymore. And actually, what I find a lot of is there's a lot of people who claim they have hormone problems who don't actually get their hormones measured. And I think the reason for that is because they're afraid if they get them measured and find out that there's nothing wrong, that they won't have an excuse anymore.
Anything to blame on. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm not saying there isn't, people will say, well, it's insulin or whatever. And I'll say, well, look at the studies where, they like inject insulin. It actually tends to increase energy expenditure, if anything. So I don't think it's insulin, now you could argue like some of, actually, this is a great example of this. So there was a recent meta-analysis that came out from a guy named Ludwig out of Harvard, big low carb proponent.
Yeah.
And basically, the conclusion was he was reanalyzing a study from Kevin Hall. I don't know if you're familiar with Kevin Hall's work, but Kevin Hall did a meta-analysis of 28 controlled feeding studies. So basically, the inclusion criteria was the food had to be provided to the participants, because we know how difficult compliance can be in diet studies. And they had to measure body composition or energy expenditure. Now, basically, Hall's meta-analysis showed that there was really no difference when protein and calories were equated. There was no difference based on the carbohydrate and fat content of the diets in terms of energy expenditure or fat loss. And actually, it favored the low-fat diets slightly, very slightly. But in my mind, it not a physiologically relevant amount, if that makes sense. So Ludwig reanalyzed this and said, okay, well, I want to look at the studies that were longer than 17 days. Okay, this arbitrary cutoff, 17 days. And he said, well, people weren't low carb adapted. They weren't keto adapted. So when you include those studies, when you separate out those studies, the studies longer than 17 days, he showed that, actually there's this significant increase in energy expenditure on low carb diets. And of course, the low carb community took that and went crazy about it.
Right.
So I actually looked at the study because I'm like, okay, well, if we're getting an increase in energy expenditure, it has to come from somewhere, right? So Ludwig's own study was one of the studies included this meta-analysis. So Ludwig had this study where they had people on maintenance calories, and they either put them on low carb, medium carb, or high carb diets. And they showed an increase of 400 calorie per day energy expenditure on the low carb diet. Now, here's where people who don't read the fine print of this stuff get lost. They measured their resting energy expenditure. There was no difference in the groups. They measured physical activity. There was no difference. So where is this difference in energy expenditure coming from? Well, when you look at the methodology used, there's basically a couple ways to measure energy expenditure. You have your metabolic ward, metabolic chamber stuff, which is a direct measurement of energy expenditure. It can be indirect, but it's the most direct measurement of energy expenditure. And then you have something called doubly labeled water. Now, if you're going to do a free living study that's a long period of time, you're going to use doubly labeled water, because doing a metabolic chamber, any more than a month, it's just completely impractical, because you literally are housing people in food jail, basically.
Right.
And you've got to, I mean, if you're going to take people out of their jobs and have them contained in a chamber for a month, you got to pay them. It gets very,
Right.
very expensive. So, anyways, basically, what you see is all the studies that favored the low carb were all done with doubly labeled water. And the other thing I pointed out was that in none of these studies that showed an increase in energy expenditure, none of them showed a difference in body composition. So, if you're truly getting an increase in energy expenditure, wouldn't we see a difference?
Yeah.
We should see a difference in body composition, especially if
Right.
these are longer term, but we don't. And so if you really look through the literature, what you find is that low carb diets, uh, doubly labeled water doesn't appear to be
An
validated
effective
for
way.
low carb diets.
Yeah. It's not
And
effective way. Yeah.
the technical reason for that is probably because on a low carb or ketogenic diet, the amount of CO2 you expire is greater than the amount predicted based on these equations. And that CO2 amount, that gas exchange ratio of O2 to CO2, is one of the components of this equation that helps determine total daily energy expenditure.
Mm.
So, like if you look at again, metabolic chamber is a direct measurement. So if you look at metabolic chamber data on normal diets, it has about a 0.8-ish R value, which is basically a measurement of how tightly correlated these two are. A
Right.
0.8 is pretty good.
Right.
With low carb diets, it's a 0.5, which means that it's not so good. So again, all that to kind of wind back to say that if you are having trouble losing weight, there is either you're eating too much. Now, when I say that, people get really offended because they think I'm accusing them of being gluttons.
Right.
No, I'm saying that you might be eating too much based on your goals and your current level of energy expenditure. I'm not saying you're a glutton. Okay, so please take your emotions out of it. If I'm trying to get ready for a bodybuilding show and I have stopped losing weight and I'm eating 2,000 calories a day and I'm exercising for an hour and a half a day, I'm not being a glutton. I'm just eating too much for my current goal.
And too much could be a couple hundred calories a day, because over the course of the week, that's 1,000 calories. I mean, or it's actually more than 1,000. So we're talking about small amounts here, right?
Well, this is the thing that people. This is the uncomfortable part of this conversation that I have to have with clients quite a bit. People say people lie. I don't know if it's a case of lying so much as people are terrible at estimating how many calories they eat.
Right.
So there was a study a while back. There's a couple studies I'm going to cite here, but there was one study where they put people in metabolic ward and had them track their calories and report them. And then the researchers were also tracking exactly how much they ate. They found that the people underreported their caloric intake by about 50%. So most likely it's not your hormones. It's the fact that you're not accurately tracking what you're eating. And when I say that, I'm not saying that you're necessarily lying, but people don't people will diet well during the week and then they'll go crazy on the weekends. They'll be like, oh, I'm eating 1,500 calories, can't lose weight. No, you're eating 1,500 calories during the week and then you're eating 4,000 on the weekends.
Right.
That's why you can't lose weight.
Right.
They grab a handful of nuts or they take licks and bites and snacks that they don't account for. And those can add up to a significant amount throughout the day. And then if you've never actually, I had this with, I still remember this conversation on Instagram with a lady. She was saying she was eating 1,600 calories. And I said, listen, have you ever had the experience of like weighing every single piece of food that goes in your mouth and tracking it? And she was like, no. I said, listen, I'm not saying you got to do this for the rest of your life. I just want you to do this for 1 week. I don't want you to change anything about your diet. I just want you to track it. 2 days later, she came back and says, oh my God, I'm eating 2,700 calories. I said, yeah, and actually it's probably more than that, because guess what happens when people when you tell them to weigh everything, they stop snacking and they stop taking licks and bites of stuff because you're not going to weigh like a lick of something while you're cooking, right?
Right.
So those add up. People say, well, it's only 50 calories here, this, there. Yeah, 50 calories in isolation isn't going to make you fat. But when you add it up over the course of the day, it's a huge difference. And now just to show you how powerful the cognitive dissonance is of people not wanting to admit this to themselves, there was a study done where the researchers gave doubly labeled water and basically told people, listen, we're going to know if you're overeating using this method. Okay. We're going to know how much you're eating. We want you to report accurately. So, of course, people did not report accurately.
Right.
And the researcher, they actually argued with the researchers about how much they were eating, right?
You're wrong. You're wrong. Yeah,
You're
right.
wrong.
Yeah.
So it goes to show like it feels like an attack when somebody says that to us. And that's where people can get sucked into this whole, calorie deficits don't work, or, I have a bad metabolism or this and that. I'm not saying there aren't people out there who have slow metabolisms. There are some people who have, slower than normal, resting energy expenditure. But it's not why most people can't lose weight. And in fact, they've done numerous studies where they've taken obese or type 2 diabetics and looked at their resting energy expenditure and seen that it's not different from people who are lean. Actually, like usually overweight people have higher resting energy expenditure than people who are lean.
Of course, there's a lot more for energy to do. I mean, they have big
Right.
bodies.
Right. Now, if you equate lean body mass, there's no difference, right? Like there's very little difference. But
Right.
still, obese people tend to have higher lean body mass just because they're carrying around more total mass. And then you look at what was I going to say? They also, type 2 diabetics and obese people lose just as much, if not more weight than predicted compared to lean individuals or non-obese individuals. So, it's on average, this isn't the reason that people are having trouble losing weight. Now, the difference is, there's kind of like two camps right now that have been divided. There's like a camp where it's nothing is your fault. It's all the evil food industry, you it made you fat. And then there's the other camp of
chemtrails are making you fat. I know.
Yeah.
It's everything makes people fat today. Right.
And then there's the other camp it's all your fault. You're just a glutton. You're lazy. Both of these are not helpful narratives. They're both wrong. There is absolutely something with obese people in terms of like their level of food reward. Trauma seems to play a role in it. Some people use food for comfort. There's a sociological aspect. I mean, think about the last time you went to a social event and there wasn't food. There's a psychological aspect to it. There's evidence that some foods, that food addiction is the wrong term, but food dependence. And there's obviously the hyperpalatability issue, and all those things matter. And even like right down to obese people get a higher reward from food. Like my wife has commented, she's like, you don't give a damn about food. Like it's just fuel for you. I don't put food on a pedestal, but other people I've talked to, I had a good conversation with Ethan Suplee. Are you familiar with him? He's an actor who lost a ton of weight.
Yeah. I follow him on Instagram.
Yeah. So really nice guy.
I loved My Name Is Earl. I go back to old episodes of it. I love that show. Right.
Yeah. So Ethan talked about how, so actually when I was out there, we trained together. I was out in California, and I said, you want to grab a bite to eat afterwards? And he said, no. And I said, okay, no worries. And he said, actually, the reason I said no was I don't really like eating in front of people, because of, and he's like, also, like, I know if I go out to eat, like I have this background where I used to put food on such a pedestal that it's just not a healthy thing for me. I said, okay, cool, no problem, but that was a really interesting insight, right? Like, whereas I go out to eat, I don't even think twice about it. I'm just like, all right, it's food, right? But that's not the same for everybody. So, this idea that you're a glutton, you're a sloth, that's a very unhelpful narrative. And even like when you look at, they did a survey of obese women, and they found that out of 100 obese women, 60 had some kind of sexual assault or trauma in their background. Right. Many of them had said, I became big so that men wouldn't be interested in me, or that I felt like I could defend myself, So all this stuff matters. All this stuff matters, but it's a combination. There is a personal accountability issue, and there's also the issue of, all these other things as well.
Right. But the good news is if you do eat good, healthy foods and you watch your calories and you're diligent about it day in and day out for months, one of the things I love to talk about is I was 330 pounds when I first show, it's because I had saved my own life. I was getting ready to have a pacemaker, and I found weightlifting, and I found clean eating, and I changed. I lost 100 pounds. And one of the things I like to talk to people about is I didn't become 330 pounds overnight. It took me a
Right.
decade. And if you think you can do this for a decade and become overweight and then flip a switch, buy a meal, buy a supplement, and in 6 months you're going to be able to go to the beach, you're wrong. If it took you 10 months years to shed that fat, the people are too ambitious, or if I don't know if it's they the deception in the diet industry, but people think that it's just going to boom, boom. I'm going to look great in a couple months.
Well, if I can draw another financial comparison, it's kind of the, fad diets and these products and whatnot. It's kind of like people who want to get rich quick, right? And so it's like buying lottery tickets to get rich, or it's like, yeah, sure. I mean, somebody's going to win, but it's not going to be you,
Right.
based on the statistics, or it's like, the weekend courses you can take learning how to flip houses that the government pays for and only work 4 hours a week and make six figures. Like, come on. I mean, yes. Is there one or two people out there who that'll work for? Yeah, of course. But like for the vast majority of people, they lose their ass doing that sort of thing. Pyramid
Right.
schemes. Because it's what works for success on average financially is very boring. It's very boring. It's about being consistent. It's
Yes.
about saving. It's about making sacrifices in the short term so that you can have more in the long term, right? And so I think that's very unsexy for a lot of people, and I
Yes.
think there must be some kind of secret. And I try to tell people there is no secret. There's no secret. It's and people
Consistent.
they get it confused. The answer is simple, but that doesn't mean the implementation is simple,
Right.
because it's if it was just if this is a great another financial comparison I make. Yes, you need to eat less calories, move more, right? If you want to create a calorie deficit. So why are people fat, right? It's not an information thing. Well, why are people broke?
Right.
If
Because
you,
they spend more
if
than
you,
they earn. Right.
yeah, I mean, when I was making $20,000 a year as a grad student, I was actually saving money. I saved a little bit of money every month. Now, I didn't have much of a life, and I didn't go out and do much stuff, right? So sacrifice, but I was able to do that. It just meant a lot more sacrifice than when I was making, over six figures, right? So I could afford to be a little more wasteful. Yeah, and I think that that's a big component that people miss out on. That this idea that there's some quick fix or something that's like, no, no. If you failed a diet, think about all the times that diet didn't work. It wasn't because you didn't have the perfect macronutrient ratio, or you ate past this certain time, or your fasting window wasn't long enough. It's because you just stopped doing it. It's because your habits and behaviors were incorrect. And you just talked about it, Carl. You got overweight over a 10-year period. You built habits and behaviors over that 10-year period where some of this stuff was just autopilot. I'm sure there were
Right.
some things you were doing, like eating certain calorie dense foods in certain situations, that were simply autopilot. I mean, I know I'm a PhD in nutrition. When I transition from like a bulking season to a cutting phase, it will take me a couple weeks to get out of my bulking habits, right? Like when I was bulking, I would have a bowl of ice cream every night. And then when I get in the cutting, I'm like, I like go to have my bowl of ice cream. I'm like, oh shit, I can't do that. That's not right. Yeah, like
Right.
I can do it, but it's going to make it much harder for me, you know. And then the other thing is, like, I just got out of this cutting phase where I did the shred with Layne thing in November. I still have some of those habits. Like I'm still like this morning, I got up and I could eat like just like a quick bowl of oatmeal or cereal or something like that to get out the door real quick to go train. But okay, I made up some rice cakes with the protein cookie butter, and like then
Right.
I did like a lot more effort than I normally would because I've still maintained some of those habits from that weight loss
Right.
phase.
Right.
And I think that's the biggest thing, right? When it comes to spending and saving, no one out there would argue. I don't think anyone out there would argue that if you want to save money, you need to earn more than you spend. I don't think anybody would argue that.
Or more like realistically, spend less than you earn. A lot of times we can't earn more. but we
Right.
can spend less. That's in our control.
Correct. And that's kind of like calories. You can eat
Yeah.
less, even if
Yeah.
you can move more. Um, but so why are people broke? I mean, they have that information. Why can't they just not be broke? Because their habits and behaviors. The same reason somebody goes on a food binge is the same reason somebody goes on a shopping binge, because they're trying to placate that trauma or pain, or not deal with their whatever's bothering them, right? So it's
Yeah.
not an information problem, it's a habits and behaviors problem. It's the same thing, going and getting a Starbucks every morning, right? Like, I listen to a financial guy, and I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's kind of like a little bit like me for finances, named Dave Ramsey.
Oh yeah. I
And
love. Yeah. Yeah.
one of the things he said that really resonated with me was, when people have a lot of debt, he recommends paying the smallest debt first, and then the next debt, and then the next debt, and the next debt. And people have said, that's stupid. Why wouldn't you just pay off the highest interest rate first? And he said, because if we were doing math, we wouldn't be in this situation, right? That's like
Mhm.
people who are like, why not just do an all protein diet? Because that's, higher TEF. And it's like, well, you're doing math, but if we were doing math, you wouldn't be in this situation, right?
Right.
It's,
Right.
it's a habits problem. It's a habits problem. So trying to get you some quick wins, trying to change your habits. That's what,
Right.
and as I was writing my book, Fat Loss Forever, um, one of the things that it's so funny. When I write, I learn so much. When I want to learn about something, I end up writing about it, because I just learn so much. Like every debate I've been in recently, I end up writing a big article afterwards, because I just learned so much, going through that process.
Right.
And, um, writing that book, I really realized, man, all these diets, like if you look at them, there was actually a recent meta-analysis. There's been two meta-analysis looking at like different named diets. So different popular diets, Mediterranean, plant-based, Whole 30 or whatever, you pick a ketogenic, Atkins. And they basically show that there was no difference in long-term weight loss with any of them. They were all pretty equally terrible.
Right.
Not because they don't work, but because people have trouble sticking to a particular diet. But when
Right.
they did a regression and they looked at, okay, of the people who were compliant over the long term to those diets, what happened? Well, they found that compliance almost was perfectly associated with weight loss, almost perfectly. And what the conclusion of the authors on both these studies is the individual should choose the diet that they feel like they can adhere to.
The same.
And I
Sure.
and I tell people, do the diet that feels the least restrictive to you, that feels the easiest to you. And it's really that consistency. I put up a post in our Carbon Diet Coach Facebook group today, and I said, be honest with yourself. Just I know that weight loss can be a frustrating thing. I know, when your weight fluctuates, it can make you feel bad. I want you to do this for 6 months. For 6 months, be consistent. You don't have to be perfect. Be consistent. Don't have any huge blowouts. Just be consistent. Just try to get close, right? And do that every day. And if you do that, not even every day, like just most, like the vast majority of the time, right?
Yeah. 80%. Right.
With
Right.
no big blowouts, and you will be shocked at what will happen in 6 months. Because when you failed before, it wasn't because you didn't have all these little variables in check. It was because you went on vacation for a week and you fucked off and did whatever. That's why. And you came back and you were 10 pounds heavier. You
And
just,
people, and here's the interesting thing about that. People always find a reason to derail their success. Case
yeah,
in point, they just start a diet. Oh, but this weekend we promised to go out with so and so and her husband. And then they get back on the diet. And then it's like, say no to those things. Look at Ethan Suplee, right?
Mhm.
Regardless of how anybody would say, oh, that's weird or whatever, he knows himself. He's
Yeah,
not going to let himself get derailed. He doesn't care. He's
yeah,
like, no, I know what works for me. But people won't do that. It comes full circle to what you said, why people are broke. People know that if they spend more than they earn, they're going to be broke. And people know if they eat more than the energy they expend, they're going to be fat. But they always find a reason that they have no choice but to derail themselves.
Carl, you brought up a really good point just there. And there was actually a systematic review that just came out by a PhD candidate named Marie Spreckley. I'm going to give her a shout out. Actually made me feel really good. She said she read my book, Fat Loss Forever, and it inspired her to go back and do a PhD and do this systematic review. So pretty awesome. Like that's where, honestly, like those are some of the best compliments I can get when I find out that other people say I went and did a PhD or a master's because of you, or like I love hearing from students. That's the best thing in the world, because they're going to go out and they're the ones that are going to go change the world by how many people they impact. So she did a systematic review of people who lose weight and keep it off. Like, what are these characteristics? What do these people have in common? And, the same old things came up with self-monitoring, cognitive restraint, a lot of these things. But the one thing that I hadn't heard before that was interesting was they talked about how they had to form a new identity. They had to form a new identity. And I think a lot of people want to keep portions of their old identity. Well, we go out on the weekends, and I on Friday I go for drinks and do this thing.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying you can never do those things. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, if you think you can keep the habits and behaviors you had and make this change, you're kidding yourself.
Right.
That you have to, as Ethan Suplee says, I killed my clone today. You have to kill your clone. That person is gone. You have to be a different person. And that's very, very hard for some people, because even though they want to lose weight, they don't want it more than they want their comfort zone.
Yes.
And listen,
do it for 6 months, like you said. Okay, you can go out for drinks and do all those things, just not for 6 months. It's not forever, just 6 months.
Or you have to do things like, for me, like I'm a flexible dieter, right? But if I'm going out to a restaurant, not right now, because I'm eating about 3,500 calories a day. I've got quite a bit of flexibility. And also, shameless plug for Carbon, in our calorie planner, you can, adjust different days. So you can have higher or lower calorie days. It will automatically adjust your other days. So I do that for the weekends. I give myself more flexibility on the weekends. So I can have, 4,000 calories. So I'm not really limited by what I can do. But if I was dieting, and we were going to go out somewhere, and I had a limitation on what I could have, well, I'm going to find out what the restaurant is. I'm going to look up what they've got before I get there, and I'm going to have a plan when I get there. Now, again, that might seem weird to some people, but hey, I'll take a Dave Ramsey quote: "Normal is fat, broke, and stupid. Be weird." Okay.
I love it.
If the thing is, if you want something you've never had, you've got to do something you've never done. Right. Yeah. Now, taken too far, you can get into disordered eating patterns for sure. And I don't recommend those. That's not a good idea. You don't want to become somebody who obsesses about food. But there's a difference between obsessing about food and saying, okay, I'm going to take 5 minutes, look up what's online here, because I'm still going out. I'm still being social. I'm still, I tell people, like, I had ice cream every week when I was doing Shred with Layne. I ate popcorn. I ate all the foods I loved. I had beer every week, but I just had to plan for it, and I had to budget appropriately, right? It's the same thing. Like, if I want to go buy a new car, I can go buy a new car. But if I want to keep on my budget, I've got to trim back in some other places. So it's very much like that. And I think that I want to reframe it for a lot of people, because I think personal responsibility is really intimidating for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's almost like blaming them. It's like, it's all your fault.
Yeah. And look at it as empowering, because if there's no personal responsibility, if the food industry really made you the way you are, all these things made you the way you are, then you're not able to change.
You have no hope.
That means that you're fated to what you have. And that's not true. Yes, some of us start on the 50-yard line. Some of us start in the 10-yard line. Some of us start in the 1-yard line, but everyone can get to the goal. Okay. It might be harder for you than somebody else. Like, for example, I might have it easier than other people because I don't have that huge reward from food like some people do. But you are still able to make changes. You have free will. You can do that. But look at responsibility as freedom. Responsibility is freedom to change.
We have a couple questions we're going to answer. Well, first, my question: what do you think of the CGM? Continuous
Continuous glucose monitors, I think probably useful for some people who are, type 2 diabetics or borderline type 2 diabetics. Um, in the long run, if you lose weight, as you said, Carl, like you're nothing really spikes your blood sugar. That's because you're very insulin sensitive because you lost that weight. Um, but I think people in the initial time frame, if they're very concerned with trying to get their blood glucose down, I think that's fine. Um, I think that again, if they lose enough weight, most of them will have low flat. They'll have normal fasting blood glucose and become insulin sensitive, and they won't have to worry about that because I mean, when you lose weight, one of the things people don't understand is one of the biggest reasons you become more insulin sensitive is because of your fat cells, not because of your skeletal muscle. Your skeletal muscle is usually pretty insulin sensitive. Your
right.
fat cells become more insulin sensitive. And that means they can clear that glucose, which you can perceive as a negative thing. But it also means that, like, if you're a lean person and you've got these kind of so small, I've done a lot of studies about adipocytes in the last 10 years. Small adipocytes are very insulin sensitive. Large adipocytes are very insulin resistant, which also just completely blows apart the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. Because if your large adipocytes are insulin resistant, it means that if insulin was really so powerful in causing fat
We
gain,
we lost you. You dropped out. You said if your large adipocytes are insulin resistant, pick it up from there.
yeah, so you would actually like it'd be easier to lose weight, which is what we do see. Is if you're overweight, it actually tends to be easier to lose weight at least initially before incur metabolic adaptation and those sorts of things. So I think continuous glucose monitors are fine. I think they're a reasonable, tool, especially if somebody's wanting to get their blood glucose under control. If they're like high risk or they've just had some kind of health problem recently. But in the end, for most people, the weight loss is going to be what actually improves their overall, insulin sensitivity and whatnot.
Okay, so Robert Thompson is asking, first of all, how do you feel about dairy in general? And then he's saying, is whole milk healthier than 2% or skim? The recommendations today are conflicting.
So here's the problem. You have to define what healthy means. So
Right.
healthy is kind of a nebulous term. And I always tell people if it can mean anything, it means nothing. But without going down that rabbit hole, um, I would say that I think whole milk is probably fine, but it is very calorically dense. It does have a high saturated fat content. Um, Most of the studies that are kind of conflicting are these different observational studies or cross-sectional studies. I think I would say that on balance, if we're looking at like the risk of heart disease, cancer, and weight loss, probably skim or 2% is a better choice, only from the perspective that there's less saturated fat and there's less total calories. That certainly doesn't mean that you can never have whole milk. It's just if it's something that you're having a lot of, then you'd probably want to consume it'd be like eating lean meat versus very fatty meat, right? Like you can have a fatty steak every once in a while, but if you're eating it all the time, it's going to be really hard to to lose weight or keep it off. And as far as dairy goes, there's a lot of people make claims about dairy. I think a lot of this comes from, honestly, vegans who want people to stop, eating dairy.
Torturing animals. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at the research, I mean, people who drink more dairy are leaner, stronger, have better bone mineral density. People say, oh, well, prostate cancer, this and that. That's really only associated with whole milk and probably just because of the saturated fat content. If your total daily saturated fat content is reasonable, I don't think you really need to have much to worry
And
about.
I would also submit, and I'm not as studious about this stuff as you, and what I'm about to say is maybe anecdotal, but I would also submit that milk is probably involved only from the standpoint of obesity. I have a feeling that obese men have a higher rate of prostate cancer in general. And then when they do these studies and do you drink milk? Yeah, I do. It's like, okay, so that correlates. Did they ever do a study where they showed that the milk is causing prostate cancer?
Yeah, they control for a few variables, but again, I think it's probably more so the saturated fat content. So if your total daily saturated fat, Like if you want to have whole milk, for example, well, maybe that means you're not eating ribeye for your meat. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's a balance. It's a budget. Now, again, when we try to look at isolated nutrients, we're just really disappointed with the results. What you see is there's patterns of eating that are healthy or unhealthy. So if you take somebody, people talk about processed food. You can have processed food and be just fine. But most people who are, eat the Western diet are eating a lot of processed food that is calorically dense, over consuming calories, not exercising. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to drink. They just have overall really unhealthy lifestyle behaviors.
Right.
If you're
Right.
somebody who's exercising an hour or two a day, you get enough sleep, you limit your stress, you control your calories. I you don't like some of this other stuff. Just stop worrying about it. It doesn't
Right.
matter in
Right.
isolation, right? A great
Right.
example of this. There was a recent cohort study in Alberta, Canada, where all these studies show that red meat is associated with like cancer incidents, right? And so what they did was they had different quartiles, I think, of red meat intake and fruit and vegetable intake. And what they found was that at the highest level of fruit and vegetable intake and the highest level of meat intake, there was no difference in cancer risk compared to the lowest intake of meat when fruits and vegetables were high. Okay,
Interesting.
so now if you were at the low intakes of fruit and vegetables and compared the meat intakes, you had higher risk of cancer in high meat, low fruits and vegetables versus low meat, low fruits and vegetables. But this points to the fact that it's eating patterns that determine our outcomes. People who eat a lot of meat tend to eat less fruits and vegetables. Okay. And they also tend to have other unhealthy lifestyle behaviors. So you can make that argument for like whole milk and whatnot. So it's one of those things where I was biochemistry major as an undergraduate, so I love mechanisms. Like that
Right.
stuff I geek out over. But when you try to do isolated mechanisms to translate it into whole body results, man, it just gets super disappointing when you look at the research. It really, I think the human body is so redundant and so robust, and that's why we've been here so long. Through millions of years of evolution, that for you to get unhealthy, barring some kind of genetic, mutation or something, it takes a lot. Like, it actually, think about what has to happen for you to become type 2 diabetic. Like, you really have to beat on your body for a while. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Years and years and
Yeah,
years.
10 years, right? 10 years of beating on your body with unhealthy habits and lifestyle.
Right.
That's a long time. I mean, you can, think about unhealthy spending habits. You can drain a 401k pretty darn quick. You know what I
10
mean? But
years. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
human body is very robust. I mean, even smoking, you start smoking, it's not like tomorrow you're going to fall over dead, right? The human body is very robust. So I want people to think about eating patterns. People say, can I have red meat? Can I have this? Can I have that? You probably have most anything as long as it's, moderation in your balance, and on balance, you're also eating a lot of other healthy foods.
And you're
And you're
doing those other things, right? You're doing the
right.
right
I mean, I
sleep and
tell
everything.
people my top six, I think it's six. Forgive me if I'm wrong. So here's my rules to live as long as you can based on your genetics. Don't eat like an asshole. Don't smoke. Limit alcohol consumption. Get enough sleep. Limit your stress. Sorry, 5. Oh, and exercise. Exercise. So
Yeah.
6.
Right.
And
Yeah.
exercise way further up the chain. It could be number 1 or number 2.
Right. I
You do
agree.
those 6 things, you're 99% of the way there. Okay, and then now we can start arguing about some of this other stuff.
So Bill Bergman, he asked this in 3 different segments. So he says, is there a skinny fat solution for ectomorphs? I lost 8 pounds and haven't lost any belly fat, really. What should I do? And I'm not overweight at all. Can I take a shot at this? Because I think I've absorbed a lot of intelligence from this interview. So here's what I think you should do. I think you should get the Carbon app. Did I do that right? Am I right? Am I right?
It's great. It's great. It's great. So, Bill, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that you probably have lost some belly fat. It just may not be visually apparent to you. If we went in and did an MRI of your stomach, I would bet that you've lost some belly fat. So I think there's a couple things to unpack with this. So first off, the body types like ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph, that's been disproven. That there really aren't those sorts of body types. And in fact, there's a graphic out there where you can see Christian Bale in different movie roles, and you can see him looking like an ectomorph, a mesomorph, and an endomorph, depending on what he's doing with his resistance training and his diet. Same thing for Jared Leto. Like Jared Leto has been like emaciated in movies. He's been muscular in movies, and he's also been like obese in movies.
Right.
So, you can manipulate your body to look like any one of those. Now, as far as skinny fat, I think that that's probably somebody who just is a low responder to resistance exercise, right? So those do exist, people who don't gain muscle as quickly as people who are high responders to resistance exercise. So first off, I would say, Bill, make sure you're doing an evidence-based, resistance training program, because that's going to do more for enhancing your body composition than anything else out there. I find so many people get hung up on diet and they don't even pay attention to the resistance training. And if you're interested, we do have a product for that on my website called the Layne Workout Builder, which puts together evidence-based training templates that take the guesswork out of it for you, $12.99 a month. And then as far as diet-wise, everyone has areas of body fat that they don't lose as quickly from. And I wish we had an easy way to remedy that, but for the most part, it's just if it's an area, like for me, it's my lower back and my abdominals and glutes when I'm getting real lean for a contest, and I just have to diet for longer. It sucks. It's the fact. Some people lose it like really evenly distributed. Good for them. It may just be the last place you lose it from, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I agree with that. But again, these apps are there. Another thing is it's kind of like that old joke, "Hey God, let me win the lottery." Every night I pray and I never win, and then God says, "Hey, well, why don't you help me out and buy a ticket?" People want advice and they want help, and then you say, "Well, there's this app and this app." If you're not willing to plunk down a couple bucks to increase your knowledge and not knowledge based, I'm a big believer that if I buy a book and I get one thing out of that entire book that stays with me, that was a worthwhile buy for me. And it's not supplements, okay? It's knowledge. It's knowledge. And an app like this, or the other one, the workout app, it'll give you the knowledge. You may not have to subscribe forever. You may only have to subscribe for 6 months or a year, because once you get that pattern, then you're on autopilot, just like I was when I was a fat bastard. I was on auto. I used to go through Wendy's and I would go to the girl, "Give me 3 double stacks on 1 bun." She'd say, "What?" "Yeah, I want 6 patties on 1 bun." Because I didn't want to eat all the bread. That's how I resolved my guilt. I had a diet Dr. Pepper and I didn't eat all the bread, but I had a burger about this big. So, yeah.
Well, you did probably save yourself a few hundred calories, so there is that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, honestly, our app is great. The workout builder is great. If you're somebody who's struggling with like really long-term habits, behaviors, honestly, my book, Fat Loss Forever, I've had so much feedback from people who have lost over 100 pounds after reading that book. And people who have told me, there's actually a guy who lives right here in Tampa named Tommy. And he was actually a musician who almost died. Like he was in diabetic ketoacidosis. He almost died. And his friend told him, "Hey, you got to check out Layne." And so I actually used to train in the same gym as his friend, Bill. And Bill's like, "You should check out Layne's stuff." And, we talk now quite frequently, but he's like, the other day he told me, he's like, "Man, when I read your book," he's like, it made everything click for me in terms of why I got this way. Why, he's like, it wasn't judgmental. It wasn't, pushing any particular diet as the end all be all. It was just presenting the information in a very palatable way. And so again, I don't want to, I truly believe in the products I sell. And I mean, I sell supplements too. We have a line called Outwork Nutrition, but I will never tell people that supplements are the answers to their problems.
Right.
I look at supplements and that's the very tip of the iceberg, right? Like train a little harder, recover a little faster. So if that's important to you, great.
Gives you that extra 2-3% profit that you're looking for. So if people want to go and they want to buy the app, they want to buy the book, they want to buy the supplements, do they go to biolayne.com?
Yeah, so we have so many different products and whatnot that we actually have a landing page that shows everything that we sell. So if you just go to biolayne.com/IG, that will bring up everything. But the app is joincarbon.com, and you can find us in the App Store, the Google Play Store. My book is Fat Loss Forever. I also have a competition prep book called The Complete Contest Prep Guide. I have the Complete Reverse Dieting Guide, or sorry, my wife and I wrote that together, the Complete Reverse Dieting Guide. Then our supplement line, Outwork Nutrition. And then I also have a couple of courses for coaches called The Science of Nutrition and Training the Physique Athlete. And I'm actually currently working on putting together a coaching certification that will likely be accredited. So for people out there that will be focused on body composition specifically. So those are kind of what we sell and what we're doing. And, we're trying to we also have a team of coaches that we've also trained. So if you feel like you need like more one-on-one support, our coaches, when they take on people, they're trying to teach them the habits and behaviors so that they don't need to stay with this coach forever. That we always say we try to teach people how to fish. We don't just want to give
I
them
was just
a
going to
fish.
say, teach a man to fish. That's exactly what I was just going to say.
Right. Teach a
Yeah.
man to fish. If you give him a fish, he eats for a day. Teach him how to fish, he eats for a lifetime. So it's a pretty cool, we have a pretty cool spectrum of stuff we do. And we're really trying to positively affect as many people as we can.
All right. Well, look, it's been great to visit with you again. And I do want to have you back on the show again. I'm sure I'll get questions from the audience. If you have questions for Layne, send them to onair@superhumanradio.net, and we'll get them back on the air. It's been too long. Let's not do that anymore. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I've always enjoyed our conversations.
All right, Layne, you take care of yourself, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, brother?
You too, Carl. Thank you.
Take care.